And once you've defined something, does it have separate parts? Can you break it down into parts? Is it something that is divisible? The next common topic would be comparison. So you probably already in secondary school wrote some kind of paper in which your teacher said, compare and contrast. Did you ever have that assignment? Well, your teacher was probably unwittingly, but certainly following one of the most common of the common topics, comparison or contrast. And under that, Corbett lists similarity, things are similar, things are different, and degree. Now, degree is an interesting one. What does that mean? It means, in essence, that things might have greater intensity, or they might have more qualities of a certain thing rather than fewer. And if something changes degree by degree by degree, and then again and again, it eventually might change not just its degree, but what is called its kind. So in rhetoric, it used to be said, that's not a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind. In other words, the difference is so great that it no longer belongs to that genus. It's not at a certain level of that genus, it's actually something else. In other words, you've shifted something in a category so much that it no longer really is in that category. It's passed into another category. Relationship. Cause and effect. We've got a cause, we have an effect. We've got it in physics, we have it in human action. Don't forget that almost all these things are applied either to things, objects, concepts, or human action. So if we have a cause, we have an effect. If we have an effect, can we find the cause? If we have an effect, is there only one cause? Two causes? Three? Don't know until we examine the situation. Maybe there are multiple causes. What are the causes of wealth inequality in the United States? That's a hard one, probably not just one. Might be a number. Antecedent and consequence. Now, I must admit I have trouble separating this from cause and effect. I really do. They're very quite similar. Something has a consequence and it has an antecedent. What does antecedent mean?
Something that comes before.
Yeah, something comes before. In grammar, an antecedent is a word that comes before, say, the pronoun that is used to represent it. It's simply something that comes before. Now, it's not quite the same as cause and effect, because if something comes before something else, does it necessarily cause it? No. If you say it does, but it doesn't actually cause it, that's a fallacy. And that fallacy is called post hoc ergo propter hoc. It's listed as one of the fallacies. I forget whether Corbett gives it its Latin name, but that means just because it happened after something doesn't mean it was caused by that something that occurred before it. Not necessarily. Okay? Is that clear enough? Have you ever heard someone say something came after something else and implied that that earlier thing caused it when maybe it really didn't? I think you probably have. If you start listening carefully to the news or reading editorials or something, I don't think it'll be very long before you wake up and say, wait, post hoc ergo propter hoc, that's a fallacy. Everybody here read Love is a Fallacy yet? Okay, Jack, is it okay? Is it? It's okay. That is what we call in rhetoric a testimonial, and it is an unrehearsed testimonial. It is really good. It's funny. Max Schulman's Love is a Fallacy is funny, and it does a pretty good job of setting out fallacies, doesn't it? Yeah, okay. So there you have a testimonial, not from me, but from a disinterested party who was not set up. Circumstances. Oh, I'm sorry. Contraries and contradictions. A contradiction is what? Contradiction. What does that mean?
A contradiction is one that you make a point that opposes the point already made.
Yes. And it also can mean if A is true, then B cannot be true. In other words, if you accept A, then you can't accept B. Whereas something that is contrary doesn't necessarily carry that force. But something that's contradictory means they both can't be true at the same time. That's not possible. So sometimes you have to say, well, now wait a minute. If it's true that you have to go to high school to get this job, how come this person has that same job and hadn't gone to high school? What's wrong there? There might be something wrong. Who knows? Maybe they got it through nepotism, or maybe they falsified their resume. Who knows? A minor example, but things like that do occur. Then circumstances, possible and impossible. Is something possible or is it impossible? Or more specifically, is something likely or unlikely? And that is a judgment which is a very difficult one to make, but it is made all the time in rhetorical presentations and arguments. It is likely that. Or we know from experience that it is likely that such and such a thing will occur. If we let this country continue to build up their army more and more, it is likely that.
They'll beat us in war.
Yeah, they'll use it, or they'll beat us in war. Something bad might happen. It's likely. Why? Because in general, when countries have built up huge arsenals, they very often have used them. Always true? Not necessarily, but often true. So this goes to past fact and future fact, or what is sometimes also called past fact, we know something, and future fact, probable future fact, which is similar to probability. In other words, how likely is it that something will happen, especially if it's happened in the past? So if something has happened 10 times in the past, and you say, that couple, and this actually used to be the case, that couple got divorced every year and went to the Caribbean for a 2-week vacation and came back because that way they could file separate taxes and pay lower taxes than if they filed jointly. Something like that. It was close to that. It was true. The tax law was screwy, and there was a kind of a penalty for being married. You actually ended up having to pay higher taxes. And that's, I think that's been rectified now. I know, you're knitting your brow, Philip. Yeah, they didn't think through the tax laws. So the couples that had the money and had enough in taxes at stake, they sometimes would just get divorced and legally, and they would go, if they had to, they'd go someplace where they could get legally divorced, and then they'd file separately, and then so. Now, if you did that 10 years in a row, what would be the likelihood you'd do it in the 11th year? Pretty high, sure. Why not? Somebody takes a position on something 10 times in a row, what's the likelihood they're going to take the same position the 11th time? Pretty high. Now, all this may seem elementary. You say, oh, it's obvious. But it's not all that obvious when you say, now, how am I going to use all these things in my own argument? How can I use them when I construct an argument? So just to give you a couple of examples, and then we'll start looking at Federalist 10. Here's one having to do with genus. Harvard is a liberal arts and sciences college. Therefore, it does not specialize in training for specific jobs. How is that an example of genus, of something belonging to a larger category?
It's defining like that liberal arts colleges are not doing specific training for jobs, and then it's putting Harvard into that category.
Yes, and I myself prefer to say liberal arts and sciences because that's actually the original designation, liberal arts and sciences. I think that's the way it should be. We've shortened it to liberal arts, but it makes it sound like the place just does the arts, which isn't true. None of the liberal arts colleges do just the arts. They are liberal arts and sciences colleges, as they should be. So yes, that's an example of genus. It's also an example of what else? Those two things I read. Harvard is a liberal arts and sciences college, therefore it does not specialize in training for specific jobs. It's an enthymeme, yes! It's an enthymeme. It's two elements of a syllogism, and that third element of the syllogism is unstated. What's the third element of the syllogism?
Liberal arts and sciences colleges don't train students to do specific types of jobs.
Yes. Okay. That's exactly right. It's an enthymeme. There's a good example of a partial syllogism. And if you didn't catch that, sharpen your enthymeme antennae, because these kinds of enthymemes are used all the time, and they force you silently to supply that other premise, which sometimes is not true. But you're tricked into it because you're given the conclusion. So here's an example of a division. This comes from an older author. And this author is talking about prose style. This is Francis Bacon, writing in The Advancement of Learning in the early 17th century. And he's talking about the fact that English prose style for a while got more and more florid, more fancy, more rhetorical in an empty sense, more delighted with language than substance. And he says, these four causes concurring, so that's division right there. These four causes concurring, the admiration of ancient authors, the hate of the schoolmen, the exact study of languages, schoolmen would be scholastic philosophers, the exact study of languages, and the efficacy of preaching did bring in an affectionate study of eloquence and copy of speech. Copy means fullness of speech. Kind of someone who is not being cryptic, but is being quite full, which then began to flourish. But this grew steadily to an excess. Here we have degree. This grew steadily to an excess, for writers began to hunt more after words than matter. Now remember Polonius in Hamlet says to Hamlet, or Hamlet says to Polonius, more matter, less art. Meaning, get to the point. Don't decorate it so much. Don't elaborate it so much. They grew steadily to an excess, for men began to hunt more after words than matter, and more after the choiceness of the phrase, and the round and clean composition, the sweet following of the clauses, the varying of illustration, that after the weight of matter, worth of subject, soundness of argument, life of invention, or depth of judgment. So we have there both degree, more and more and more, and we have comparison. What did these people do who were writing? They got more interested in fancy style than they did in sound argument. Simple comparison. And they did it by degrees. Many things that are not good often occur by degrees because nobody stands up and objects. Nobody says, wait a minute, stop. If we keep on going down this road, what's going to happen? Many things that are good often happen by degrees as well. Not like that, but by degrees. And they very often happen by comparing what was once the case with what you would like it to be. You can say, well, okay, we know that. But when you start using that in your own prose, it actually becomes a quite powerful tool. There are some very fine examples in Corbett of these topics. As you read from pages 84 to 120, that's quite a lot, I know, but they're really good examples that Corbett gives of these topics. Really good ones. So comparison, similarity, we talked a little bit about that, difference. When you're doing a lot of comparison of things, so I'm going to compare this with that, and then that was something else, and so forth. Are you using deduction or induction? Who said that? Who said what? Yeah, you're using induction. Yeah, and a lot of scientific method works by induction. Let's look at this piece of evidence. Let's look at another piece of evidence. Let's compare them. Now let's go to a third piece of evidence and triangulate that, and on and on and on. It's not necessarily a case of logical deduction then. Can you use deduction in science? Of course you can use deduction in science. You'd say, well, if this is true and that is true, then this should be true. That would be a form of deduction. But a lot of it occurs by the inductive method, which is similar to a kind of experimental method. We're going to find out what the data is. We're going to find out again what it is. We're going to compare it. And then eventually, we can draw an interpretation of it. And that means we might not be perfect in the interpretation. In fact, in science, the interpretation often is not strict, but we talked about this earlier in class. It is what? It's P greater than 95, and that P represents what? Probability. Yes. So here we are even in science on probability. It's probable fact. You know, what's going to happen if we keep on burning fossil fuels? I happen to believe that the sea level is going to rise. I think that's a probable future fact. Why do I think that? Well, first of all, the sea level is already rising. Well, but what caused that? Now we're into cause and effect. Well, is it the melting Greenland ice cap? Is it thermal expansion of the sea? Water expands as it gets warmer. Is it thermal expansion? Because the sea is warmer than it was a century ago. Not just on the surface, but as far down as 1,000 feet. So you can see how debates like this are constantly engaged with these topics. Comparison, degree, cause and effect, probable future fact, likelihood, comparison. Comparison might be, well, you know, here's the Earth, the way the Earth is now, and here's the way it was 5 million years ago. Why can't it be the same? What's wrong with that? Well, maybe the climate 5 years ago, well, the climate 30 million years ago, the climate at a certain point had palm trees growing in Alaska. What is now Alaska? That's true. I'm not sure we want that. Professor Anderson, who teaches here, says that's where we're headed if we don't stop and do something relatively soon. So you begin to see that any complex situation or problem or issue, in the end, very often calls upon these verbal formula, which are nothing other than ways of thinking and then using language to express that thought. I'll pass over testimony. We already had a wonderful example of testimony here from Jack. Testimony might be authority. That's a topic. It's a form of evidence. We've talked about it before. You might be a little leery of it. On the other hand, we all use it, don't we? Do you ever write a paper with a footnote? You've used an authority. You used evidence of some kind. Testimonials. Now, testimonials are interesting. Let's examine a testimonial that we might hear in court. I'll give you an example from my own life. My wife and I were living in a town northwest of here, and we had a neighbor who was shouting at his children all the time, and I mean shouting at like 120 decibels. Get in here! And it would be all afternoon long on the weekends. And it made our life rather unpleasant. So I did the neighborly thing. I went over to him and I knocked on his door and I said, you know, we were outside with our kids the other day and it's a little loud. We had an acre of land between us, an acre. He said, oh, okay. So a few days later, we're outside. We have a little screen porch out in the back of our house, and I told you not to do that! And then on for about 30 minutes. So finally, we were so put upon that we filed a civil complaint. We thought we had no recourse. I didn't want to go over to this fellow's house too often. His job was as a demolition expert. And there was a truck always parked in his driveway that said, danger, explosives. And somehow or other it seemed to fit in with the entire situation. I was worried, I actually was. This was a man who had a violent temper. Now, I only knew that he expressed it by shouting. I didn't know any other thing. But I didn't want to go over there too many times. Finally, we filed a complaint. So, what happens when one person says one thing and another person says another thing? Is that easy to decide? It's hard to decide, alas. It is. So unbeknownst to us, thank goodness, we had a neighbor. And the neighbor volunteered to show up in court to corroborate our testimonial with another testimony. Did that strengthen our case? Yes. A lot? Yes, a lot. Because that neighbor had never come forward and made a complaint. But he was able to say in court, you know, that really is awful yelling. And we can hear it too. We're even farther away than they are. And it's disturbed us. So sometimes a single bit of evidence or a single testimonial is helpful. But what is really helpful is several testimonials. So who else has read Love is a Fallacy? Is it good? Yes, all right. There it is, you're not alone, Jake. At 2. Now, you see, in many respects, 2 testimonials are far more than twice as strong as 1. Far more.